Today we're going to talk about supplement strategies, so like nutritional supplement strategies in acute concussion recovery. So we're going to look at, I have 4 different strategies that I like to use, and we're going to look at those strategies are based on the pathophysiology. And so basically like what happens in concussion, what do we know about the metabolism of concussion, and how can we leverage nutritional strategies to promote recovery. Beyond the pathophysiology, I also try to look at the symptom picture because we can leverage within those 4 strategies. We can say, oh, if this person's having these symptoms, we know based on this thing that's happening in the brain, we could probably help with the symptoms a little bit and promote the recovery. So we can kind of knock both of those things out. Big disclaimer. This live session is for educational purposes only. It's not medical advice. Don't go changing, subtracting, adding anything without chatting with your doctor first, ideally a concussion specialist. So chat with your doctor. So what do I mean by acute? So within acute concussion, I mean acute as in the day of, the day after, up to 2 to 3 weeks after. But really we're talking about that first 7 to 10 days. And I'm going to talk about why in a second. But ideally acute means supplemental strategies the day of, the day after, up to about 1 to 2 weeks after. You can push it to maybe 3 weeks after. So if you've listened to even one of my videos, I keep looking down because I've got some notes because I want to stay on track because there's a lot with this. But if you've listened to even one of my videos or heard me ramble even a little bit, you've heard me talk about what happens in your brain with a concussion. So bear with me. So when you're hit, whether it's to the body, to the neck, to the head, there's this functional stretch and shear of your neurons. So your nerve cells functionally stretch and they shear, and this stretching and shearing leads to excitotoxicity and neuroinflammation. If you don't know what I'm talking about, lots of other videos, lots of other content, but you get this excitotoxicity and neuroinflammation, particularly calcium clogging your mitochondria up. And your mitochondria, where you get your energy from, largely your oxidative aerobic energy comes from the mitochondria. So your cells, your nerve cells after concussion get about 9 times less efficient because they're shifted to anaerobic metabolism. And so you get this functional stretch and shear, and you get this excitotoxicity and neuroinflammation, and then you got to clean that up. You've got to clean up the excitotoxicity and neuroinflammation because electrolytes were going everywhere. Calcium is flooding the mitochondria. So you got to clean that up. And that causes an energy deficit because, again, you clogged up the mitochondria. You need energy to clean up, but you can't produce the energy. So you get this energy deficit. And then secondarily, but very, very important, in a cruel trick of nature, when you need that extra energy and you need that extra blood flow and nutrition, we tend to see blood flow dysregulation. So the brain doesn't get, in animal studies, we see a decrease of blood flow up to 50% to the brain. And within 6 to 8 hours, that blood-brain barrier gets leaky. So your astrocytes that kind of block the blood vessels into the brain, their little feet that cover the vessels kind of peel away. So the blood-brain barrier gets leaky, and simultaneously that inflammation causes the gut barrier to get leaky. I think I rambled about that last time, but it might not actually be a leak. It might not be a paracellular leak. It might be an upregulation of some other, these M cells and some fancy stuff. But basically, altogether, you get this functional stretch and shear, this excitotoxicity, this neuroinflammation, this energy deficit, this blood flow dysregulation, this gut-brain disruption, and it kind of all just compounds together. And what you'll feel is that after the hit, symptoms will usually, in a normal concussion, symptoms will usually be at their worst 3 to 5 days after your injury, and they'll usually start to go away within 7 to 10 days. And so that's why I say acute supplementation for sure within that first 7 to 10 days, because you should be feeling better after that. But it doesn't mean things are better. Metabolic recovery typically happens around 21 to 30 days, which is why I push that out. Acute concussion, I push that out the day of, the day after, up to 2 to 3 weeks after. So you're at that 7 to 10 day mark, where you're at that 21 to 30 day mark, where you're looking at symptom and metabolic recovery. So yeah, that's kind of where I say, if your symptoms are lasting longer than 7 to 10 days, if they're lasting 14 days or so, if they don't go away in that normal recovery time, you're heading towards that post-concussion trajectory. And that's where supplementation would be useful anyway. So the 4 strategies we're going to look at are, again, you've got this stretching and shearing. So we want structural support. You've got this excitotoxicity and neuroinflammation, so we want inflammation and antioxidant support. We've got an energy deficit, secondary to a blood flow deficit and calcium overload. So we want some energy support. And then the fourth strategy is prevention. So if you're a contact athlete, if you're a military member, if you're someone who's at risk of head contact or blast injuries or just at risk of concussion, there are prevention strategies, nutritional strategies. I'm going to talk about that, I think, in like 2 weeks. But so let's break it down. Let's start with energy support. You've got that energy deficit. Your cells have shifted to anaerobic metabolism, largely because mitochondria are overwhelmed with calcium. So we need easy energy. When I say easy energy, I mean it doesn't need a lot of steps. It doesn't like, I'm going to botch this, but glycolysis is 12 steps. I don't know. I haven't been in biochemistry in a while. But glycolysis has multiple steps. And then after glycolysis, it's got to go through the Krebs cycle. And after the Krebs cycle, it's got to go through the electron transport chain. That takes a lot of steps. And when we need the mitochondria for that as well. And so when the mitochondria isn't doing that thing, pumping it with glucose doesn't necessarily make sense. Pumping your body, someone asked me if oxygen would be beneficial, supplemental oxygen, maybe in severe TBI, maybe if there's vital signs are crashing, but in acute concussion, not necessarily, because your mitochondria needs to use that oxygen. You might flood it with oxidative stress, basically. So we need easy energy. Neurons shift towards anaerobic metabolism. They're not good at that. So some of the research compounds we can use are things like creatine, exogenous ketones, medium chain triglycerides, acetyl L-carnitine. Acetyl L-carnitine is it basically creates this carnitine shuttle to move fatty acids across the membrane of the mitochondria. Again, maybe not super useful in the acute phases, but it can help with the kind of the fatty breakdown for energy. So easy energy. Creatine is awesome. It's a one-step energy. Creatine phosphate breaks off the phosphate, helps create ATP, helps create energy. That's one step. Medium chain triglycerides quickly turn to ketones. Ketones themselves they're easy energy, and then within that, beyond energy, ketones also protect the mitochondria, preserve neuroplasticity, prevent neuronal death. They act as like these cell signaling molecules that are also helpful in the acute concussion pathology. So again, energy support, I like things like creatine, exogenous ketones, medium chain triglycerides, acetyl L-carnitine is a cool little mitochondrial support. Moving on to the next category. So we just talked about energy. We're going to talk about inflammation and antioxidant support. So early on, we don't want to just halt inflammation. We don't want to just stop it. You need inflammation to heal. If you didn't have inflammation, none of your cuts would heal, none of your scars, anything would heal. So you need inflammation. So it's kind of this balance. You don't want to halt it. You don't want to take an NSAID. You don't want to take ibuprofen. You don't want to take a blocker. You just want to kind of regulate it. So you don't want to stop it. You just kind of want to say, hey, let's not get out of hand. Let's not turn to post-concussion syndrome. Let's not create this persistent neuroinflammation. So some of the researched compounds that we have, an awesome one is N-Acetyl Cysteine, NAC. We've also got curcumin. Curcumin's everywhere right now. Everyone loves turmeric. And then we've also got vitamin C, E, D, alpha lipoic acid, et cetera. There's a lot of things we can use. But the big, powerful ones are NAC, and I'll talk about that in a second because I'm going to talk about Cover 3. Cover 3 is a supplement that had asked me a few questions on my post February 6th. So I'm going to address those questions and talk about where I see Cover 3 fitting into the concussion world. So NAC, curcumin, vitamin C, E, really simple supplements that don't stop inflammation. Everyone thinks curcumin like stops inflammation. It's a regulator, and I'll talk about some of that later. It's a powerful regulator. It can go toe-to-toe with a lot of NSAIDs and stuff like that. It takes a little bit longer because it's not just stopping things. So structural support. So we're talking about both the functional stretch and shear of your neurons. We're talking about that structural support. And we're also talking about the structure of your gut, the gut-brain barrier, the gut-brain axis. We're talking about both those kind of structural components. So I look at that. There's research things like omega-3 fatty acids. I did a blog post about that recently. So omega-3 fatty acids, looking at the omega-3 index is a really cool tool. For seeing how much would a percentage breakdown of your membrane within your cells, how much of that is omega-3 fatty acids relative to other fatty acids, particularly arachidonic acid, which is this pro-inflammatory omega-6. And when we eat a lot of that in fried foods, so things like chips, chicken wings, fried things, upright, like increase arachidonic acid. Farmed salmon, people think they're eating healthy because they're eating salmon. Farmed, conventionally raised farmed salmon has some of the highest arachidonic acid content of any meat. I think next in line is chicken. And so there's really common healthy foods that have a lot of arachidonic acid. When that ratio gets too much relative to your omega-3s, you have a tendency towards pro-inflammatory responses, too much inflammation, because these enzymes, when you have inflammation, these enzymes go in, they take fats from the membrane to create these immune mediators. Your body can only use what it has, so it takes these fats and turns these fats into signaling molecules to tell the immune system what to do. And when your ratio of anti-inflammatory to pro-inflammatory is shifted heavily towards pro-inflammatory, you're going to have too much inflammation. So things like omega-3s can be helpful because they actually assimilate into the membrane. So they create the structure of your membrane. DHA makes up, I believe it's like 10 to 20%. Again, the stat is in the blog. 10 to 20% of all the fat in your brain is omega-3 fats, and like 90% of that is DHA. So there's EPA, DHA in your omega-3 fish oils. So you create the actual structure of your neurons, but then that structure of the neurons helps regulate the inflammation because now these enzymes have more anti-inflammatory fats to pick from. Really, really cool. Side little tangent there. Another structural component that also kind of helps with in the symptomology, when people are kind of foggy or feel like they have attention or memory issues, I like CDP choline or alpha GPC. So it's this phospholipid. So the phospholipid integrates into the lipid membrane, taking you guys back to high school biology. And then the choline helps with cholinergic system. So acetylcholine used for attention, memory, things like that. And then from the gut side of things, really simple, think like L-glutamine, probiotics, marshmallow, aloe vera, different things like that that are going to be anti-inflammatory, sort of gut healing from a structural component down here, which, believe it or not, actually helps up here. So last thing we're going to talk about, so we went through energy support, inflammation, antioxidant support, structural support, prevention. Prevention we're going to talk deeply about in 2 weeks. But the goal of metabolic concussion prevention is to really think, okay, if this person's at risk, they're a hockey player, they're a football player, they're a lacrosse player, if this person's really at risk, how can we minimize the damage? There's going to be stretch, there's going to be shear, there's going to be excitotoxicity, there's going to be a change in autonomics and blood flow dysregulation, probably. So how do we minimize the damage of that? How do we shorten the time period of recovery? How do we minimize the impact that the impact has? Because contact is a part of sports, car accidents happen, people slip and fall. So really just how can we help our brains out with that ahead of time? We're going to chat about that in 2 weeks. So in this last bit, like literally this last page is devoted to Cover 3. So Cover 3 is a supplement that I have been using more recently with certain patients that I'll talk about in a second. So I've been trialing it to see how I like it. So far, I do, and I'll talk about that in a second. But they asked me a few questions, so I posted a parent's guide to concussion on February 6th because this someone had reached out to me in the direct messages, and they were like, hey, I'm a mom that has had concussions, so all the other moms are asking me what to do with their kids if they suspect a concussion. So I was like, oh, okay, let's make a post. Let's make a little swipeable post. Like, what are the symptoms? What are the red flags? And what can we do for treatment? And I had a little bonus slide where I was like, hey, bonus, cut gluten and cut dairy for the first 2 weeks. I talked about that last week. But cut dairy and cut gluten for the first 2 weeks will minimize that gut inflammation, minimize the potential for gut-brain axis dysfunction. And they were like, hey, they asked me 4 questions. I believe I got them here. Where does nutrition rank on my priority list in concussion? What about adding nutritional support in the first hours after a questionable event? How can curcumin be used to support a healthy inflammatory response? And then resveratrol and blood flow. How could they help or hurt? So I'm going to go through all of that, and then I'm going to kind of give you my thoughts on Cover 3. So they asked, where does nutrition rank on my priority list? Hi, day 1. I talked about it last week when I was looking with sort of nutritional like food strategies. Today I'm talking about it with supplemental strategies. I like going after I don't use all of the supplements under the sun. I try to keep it to like 3 to 5. I don't like giving people like pill burden. But what are the high yield things that are going to help this person's pathophysiology? So the energy support, the inflammation antioxidant support, and the structural support. How can we do all of that as quickly as possible through food and through supplementation? So I rank it high. What about adding nutritional support in the first hours after a questionable event? So I got my notes here. So to my knowledge, we don't actually have great research on this. That's, again, to my knowledge. There might be someone else who disagrees and says, hey, yeah, we got tons of research on this. And I'm open to hearing that. But we don't have great research on this. But again, my hypothesis here, based on other people smarter than me, their research, we do not want to 100% stop inflammation. So in the first hours, or if it's a questionable event, we don't want to 100% stop inflammation. Don't reach for the NSAID. Don't reach for the anti-inflammatory medication. We need inflammation to heal injuries, and concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury. So we want that inflammation regulation. And we don't want to stop inflammation, and we do want to support easy energy in the brain. So simple 1 to 2 step molecules, again, creatine, exogenous ketones like beta hydroxybutyrate, they're my favorite. And then beyond that, anything else is kind of speculative. So what I would argue is that we want to regulate, not stop inflammation, and we want to support easy energy in those early hours after an acute event. And anything extra, anything like fancy or like biohacky or concussion adjacent, more, like good for brain health, but not necessarily good for concussion. I would argue that is speculative more than anything. But really, I think we've got some good evidence to say we don't want to stop inflammation, and we want to regulate it, and we don't want to compound the energy deficit. We want to provide easy energy to the brain. So their next question, how could curcumin be used to support a healthy inflammatory response? So we don't have a ton of models of humans in traumatic brain injury because it would be just completely unethical to smash people's heads and then just see what worked and what didn't. So a lot of those models come from animal models, particularly rats and mice studies. So animal models of TBI have shown curcumin. So curcumin is the kind of the orange color that comes out of the spice turmeric. It's in the ginger family. And we pull curcumin out. Curcumin is really cool because it's lipophilic, it's fat loving, so it'll cross the blood-brain barrier easily. The hard part is that it's hard to get into the blood. It typically has a poorer bioavailability, so a lot of supplement companies are working on trying to get the bioavailability up. So the bioavailability, the availability of it to actually get into the system, so to get into your blood. So older research showing benefits in brain health might actually be that it stayed in the gut and had anti-inflammatory effects in the gut that then worked on the gut-brain axis, which is kind of cool. So anyway, curcumin. Animal models of TBI have shown curcumin to be antioxidant, so regulating radical oxygen species. It's been anti-inflammatory, anti-apoptotic. So apoptosis is a programmed cell death. When the cell is overwhelmed, different signals will just say, hey, let's commit suicide. Let's kill the cell, but clean it up. Let's do it cleanly. So it's anti-apoptotic. It preserves neuronal cells after head injury. It's protective of that blood-brain barrier. So again, hopefully that blood-brain barrier gets a little less leaky so that we have less gut effects. It decreases brain swelling, so it decreases the edema associated with that electrolyte mix because water follows solutes. So water will follow electrolytes, and we'll get some swelling when those electrolyte ratios from inside and outside the cell get wonky. It protects the mitochondria, which protects brain metabolism, prevents inflammatory membrane turnover. So again, I was talking about that arachidonic acid and omega-3 stuff. It prevents the inflammatory turnover of membrane lipids. And it protects neuroplasticity. So how freaking cool. Specifically, it'll block the enzymes COX-1 through 3. So COX-1 through 3 are the ones that certain NSAIDs and anti-inflammatories are working on because the COX enzyme promotes inflammatory prostaglandins and leukotrienes and things like that. It blocks various cytokines, so cell signaling molecules that are pro-inflammatory, suppresses microglia. So microglia are the immune cells within your brain that promote the inflammation. So I talked about last week, lipopolysaccharide, this inflammatory trigger that comes from gut bacteria. when it makes its way into the blood, if it triggers a microglia cell, that microglial cell can be pro-inflammatory, can be primed and triggered and activated for the next 10 months. So one exposure of LPS can prime these microglial cells for 10 months. And curcumin kind of attenuates that. It says, hey, don't get so inflammatory. You don't got to react so much. It decreases excitatory amino acids like glutamate. And then via this sirtuin-1, so via this certain enzyme that regulates DNA acetylation and expression, it promotes DNA survival, which down the chain promotes normal protein synthesis. So if your DNA is intact, your protein is going to be intact, which is pretty cool for the cell. So what do I think about curcumin? I think it does awesome things. I just kind of rambled off a lot of fancy sciencey details, but I think it does awesome things. The lipophilic nature, again, allows it to cross the blood-brain barrier. So if we can get it into the blood, I think Mariva, there's another one that's not on the top of my head, but there's a couple supplement patented versions of curcumin out there that have very cool implications for getting into the blood, which has cool implications for neurodegeneration. So if we're thinking about the mixed bag of research that doesn't really point towards concussion leading to CTE, but doesn't not point that direction, curcumin can be a cool supplement in that kind of neurodegenerative realm. So what do I think of it regulating inflammation? I think it's awesome because it works on multiple mechanisms. It's not just one thing, like a drug. So trans resveratrol and blood flow. How could it help or hurt? So resveratrol, found in grape skins. People think like that's why they think wine is healthy, is because resveratrol content in red wine. So resveratrol also been found, similar to curcumin, also been found to block COX-1 through 3, cytokines, suppress microglia, decrease the pro-inflammatory or like excitatory, I shouldn't say pro-inflammatory, decrease excitatory amino acids like glutamate. As well, it increases BDNF. It increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is super crucial for plasticity, and it protects DNA via that SIRT1 activity. It's also been shown to maintain the extracellular matrix, and decrease swelling, so kind of maintain the integrity of the structure. There are some human trials, so they're asking about blood flow. Cover 3 asked me about blood flow. Some human trials showing increased blood flow and decreased inflammation via regulation of this NF-kappa B inflammatory regulator. Overall, it's really cool in mild traumatic brain injury. Resveratrol is really cool in mild traumatic brain injury and neuroprotection. With respect to the blood flow mechanism, I'm not sure I can give a great answer. So again, I only saw that one little kind of note in a few studies saying like, yeah, there's probably increased blood flow and decreased inflammation. So I like to regulate blood flow through things like paced breathing, subsymptom threshold exercise, and oculomotor things, because these help to recover. In concussion, the reason we have dysregulated blood flow is because there's altered cerebrovascular reactivity. So there's altered blood flow responses to carbon dioxide. There's altered cerebral autoregulation. So there's altered blood flow in response to blood pressure. Altered neurovascular coupling. So altered fuel utilization based on brain activation. So normally we'll shunt blood to the area of the brain that needs the most energy. Well, in concussion, that kind of gets wonky. We don't necessarily shunt blood where it needs to go. We don't shunt blood based on energy demands. And then there's also the neuroautonomic regulation of heart rate variability, parasympathetic, sympathetic balance. So resveratrol, while it may increase blood flow, I haven't seen any research that says it works on these mechanisms that we know are disrupted. So while it probably helps, we see the neuroprotective benefits, inhibiting inflammation, suppressing microglia overactivation, promoting neuroplasticity. There are benefits, but whether it is the biggest player in blood flow, probably not. So I wouldn't say it hurts, and I wouldn't even say that it helps. It probably just kind of like helps. So it's not going to be the big player, as far as I know right now. And again, someone might know otherwise, but right now I use paced breathing, heart rate variability, biofeedback, subsymptom threshold exercise, and then different autonomic rehabs we can use with vestibular stuff, without getting into too much detail. So that was that. So my thoughts on cover 3. I've been trialing cover 3 in acute and chronic concussion patients. And here's kind of the moment of truth. I think cover 3 is awesome for chronic patients. I don't think it's the best supplement for acute patients. So I think it's great for the folks who are like, because again, a lot of people watching this, or a lot of people who follow me on social media, are people who have had multiple concussions over the years, or they've had a concussion and their symptoms still haven't gone away, and it's been 3, 6, 9, 12, 47 months. I think that's where cover 3 fits. I think cover 3 could be useful if they made a couple tweaks in the acute stages. So the ingredients of cover 3: cholesterol. There's cholesterol in cover 3, critical to membrane health. You need cholesterol. You need cholesterol for hormones. You need cholesterol for membrane fluidity and integrity. So there's cholesterol, there's vitamin C, and there's vitamin E, which fits that excitatory antioxidant support. There's curcumin, which we just talked in great detail about. That's anti-inflammatory, excitotoxic prevention. There's resveratrol, which we just talked about. There's uridine, which we haven't talked about. There's alpha GPC, which we kind of talked about with the CDP choline. It's kind of the structural cholinergic support. And there's omega-3s. I love all of these ingredients for individuals looking to quell inflammation. So this is a very anti-inflammatory formula. There's omega-3s, there's curcumin, there's trans-resveratrol, there is vitamin C and E. There's all these things that quell inflammation, that kind of calm inflammation, but it doesn't quite cover the broad picture that we need in acute concussion, because there's not any great energy support. There's no real energy support in this cover 3 formula, and energy support is honestly, I think, critical in the early stages, at least clinically in my practice. Energy support is the thing that patients notice. It's the thing that, yeah, this anti-inflammatory stuff is cool. Yeah, I trust that it's going to help my brain, but I don't feel it. And that's one of the things that it can be helpful, especially in athletes that need to return or that want to return. We can tolerate rehab better. We can get through our days. We can sleep. We don't have the same headaches. We don't have the same fog when we can support the easy energy. And so that can make rehab go smoother. It can make the mental state a little bit better when we feel a little bit better. So again, cover 3, I love it for the post-concussion stages. I love it for the prevention. Like if you're like, I'm not sure about CTE, but I've got this long history of concussion and I just want something that's good for my brain, cover 3. I think in that aspect, in acute concussion, it's concussion adjacent. In post-concussion, it's concussion specific. It's great for quelling that inflammation. You probably don't have the same energy deficits in post-concussion. At that point, it's an autonomic dysregulation. It's a metabolic inflammatory thing, which cover 3 is going to help with. It's a visual vestibular issue. It's a cervical spine issue, or it's psychological, mental, emotional trauma that's got to be resolved. And so at that point, your energy deficit probably isn't there, and that's where cover 3 definitely helps. So how would I tweak it? So I can't just critique it and then not say anything about it. So I would add, if I were to change cover 3 for my acute patients, I would keep everything the same, but in the acute stages, drop the uridine and drop the resveratrol. And I would replace that with some energy support. And I would also add NAC. So basically, I would add creatine monohydrate or crealkaline. Creatine is one of the supplements that patients notice. It's a one-step energy process. It's anaerobic. Patients notice it. They're like, oh, when I added that, I didn't quite notice that I noticed it until I stopped taking it. So they take it and they're like, yeah, I feel pretty good on it. I forgot it for a couple of days, and holy crap, I noticed that I forgot it for a couple of days. So creatine is it's a great supplement. It's heavily researched. It's probably one of the most researched supplements we've got in the ergogenic world in terms of sports and fitness, second to maybe caffeine. And so it's awesome. We see it's beneficial for healthy folks as well under cognitive and physical stress. Brain energy levels get depleted. We can see it we'll talk about creatine actually from a prevention standpoint in a couple of weeks. Yeah. And then maybe add some exogenous ketones. So some beta hydroxybutyrate or MCT oil along with the omega-3s. It's a quick step to ketones, and ketones, again, I talked about briefly, but ketones are neuroprotective, mitochondrial protective, neuroplasticity protective. So I would add an energy support, and or like either or both creatine and some sort of ketone source. And then the other thing that I would definitely add, rather than uridine or resveratrol for acute patients, is N-Acetyl Cysteine. So NAC, N-Acetyl Cysteine. NAC is the precursor for our master major antioxidant, glutathione. And glutathione can help then counter that excitotoxicity, that oxidative damage, to regulate inflammation without squashing it. And what we've seen is we studied NAC. So we gave soldiers with concussion NAC or a placebo, and the NAC group saw an 86% reduction in symptom severity compared to the placebo that saw a 42% reduction. So we saw a double of symptom reduction, a double of feeling better from NAC. And again, what I've seen clinically is creatine makes people just feel better. So mixed with the other ingredients, keeping the curcumin, keeping the alpha GPC, keeping the omega-3s, keeping the vitamin C and E, keeping the cholesterol, dropping the uridine and transveratol, but adding some NAC, adding some creatine or MCTs, for sure the creatine, for sure the NAC, patients are gonna feel better on that acute concussion supplement. So I think they should, if I was advising Cover 3, which I'm not, I would keep the current formula, advertised to chronic kind of post-concussion patients, and then I would change the formula for acute concussion patients. So big recap, because we've gone 30 minutes here. I use supplements. I love supplements in acute concussion. I don't try to give people grocery bags full of supplements. It irks my system so much to see functional medicine providers send people home with grocery bags of hundreds up to thousands of dollars worth of supplements. It drives me nuts. So I use supplements acutely to support structural repair, to support energy metabolism, and to regulate that inflammation and excitotoxicity. Cover 3 is a great supplement. I love it. It's tasty. It's super easy. The reason I like it is from a post-concussion perspective. It takes like 5 or 6 bottles of supplements that you would need like different pills and drops and powders for. And it puts it into one little like tasty packet. So again, I'm not affiliated with them, but I do like them a lot. I see their current formula more towards post-concussion, more towards PCS patients. I'd love to see Cover 3 support the energy deficit early and kind of offer a separate acute supplement that has the creatine, the NAC, maybe some MCTs. So next week, we're going to look at post-concussion. So how do I leverage this for post-concussion? So today I gave you kind of a big picture. I look at all of this for acute concussion. I look at it very similarly, but different for chronic concussion, for post-concussion. And then the week after that, so in 2 weeks, we're going to look at concussion prevention, which I think is awesome for the athletic population. So that is that. Thank you to everyone for joining me. Appreciate all of you. Leave questions in the comments if you have any. And I will see you next week to talk supplements in post-concussion syndrome. And